David Carson stood in the doorway of his bedroom, observing the scene with a mix of disbelief and resignation. Tori, his wife, and Joe Benetti were entangled on the bed, their actions leaving little to the imagination. Despite the shock of discovering his wife's infidelity, David remained surprisingly composed. Instead of succumbing to rage or arousal as he had heard others might, he took a quick photograph as evidence and quietly left the room. Downstairs, David poured himself a strong drink, reflecting on the situation. Finding Tori's phone abandoned and clothes strewn around the living room confirmed his suspicions and filled him with bitter realization. It was a classic scenario, coming home early from a business trip to find his wife in bed with another man, in this case, the pompous Joe Benetti, known for his connections through his older brother in the local mob circles. David's response was stoic. He understood Tori's nature all too well, having married her despite knowing her history. Her past had foreshadowed this moment of betrayal. As he sipped his whiskey and scavenged the fridge for a meal, he pondered whether people truly change or merely hide their true selves. The drama of his marriage had worn him down over the years. Tori's tendencies to escalate minor issues had pushed David to consider divorce even before tonight's revelation. Now, he saw a clear path forward, relieved of guilt and ready to protect what was rightfully his. Just as he was preparing to leave, Tori entered the kitchen, unleashing a torrent of questions and accusations. David's response was blunt and matter-of-fact. "I live here." Joe's sudden appearance, naked and wielding a lamp from David's nightstand, only added to the surreal nature of the confrontation. Misinterpreting David's calm demeanor for fear, Joe stumbled over his words. In that moment, David Carson realized that his decision to end his marriage was not just about infidelity. It was about reclaiming his peace of mind and moving forward without the burden of Tori's tumultuous presence in his life. David Carson stood in disbelief as Joe Benetti threatened him, waving a lamp dangerously. The whiskey fueled a primal decision, leading David to grab a carving knife from the kitchen counter, a wedding gift from his aunt and uncle. It was a surreal moment for everyone present. In a haze of shock and fear, David fatally stabbed Joe. He had never imagined taking a life, and the weight of Joe's final moments struck him deeply. David's actions then turned to Tori, who began to scream. In a moment of unprecedented violence, he struck her, rendering her unconscious. The gravity of his actions sobered David instantly. He realized the consequences. John Benetti, Joe's brother, would seek revenge, and David's life was now in jeopardy. Contemplating his next moves, David bound and gagged Tori, securing her to their bed, then turned to his computer for a desperate search: how to disappear. As he researched methods to vanish without a trace, David found a semblance of a plan by dawn. Checking on Tori, who struggled against her restraints but seemed physically unharmed, David retreated to the guest room for a brief rest, knowing his life would never be the same. When David awoke at 8, he allowed Tori a brief reprieve to use the toilet, still bound and gagged. Contemplating asking her why, he decided against it, expecting excuses or blame. He secured her back onto the bed and whispered, "Stay put. I won't risk my life because of your mistake. Tomorrow, someone will know where you are. You'll suffer for 24 hours, I'll live in fear forever. Goodbye." He looked at her one last time, questioning his past decisions. David prioritized securing funds from his assets and transferring them abroad without alerting authorities. Cash advances, investments, and home equity were on his list. He needed to act quickly but discreetly to avoid suspicion, as his online research had advised. By 1 in the afternoon, David had amassed $100,000 and a first-class ticket to Rome. From there, he planned to exploit lax European Union regulations in semi-autonomous regions, disappearing into obscurity. Meanwhile, in her office, Karen Rowland pondered how to delicately inform her client about her husband's affair with his secretary. As she focused on her computer, the office door opened unexpectedly. Her assistant's oversight left her vulnerable, compounded by the inconvenience of her prosthetic leg needing adjustment. Before she could react, a Southern European-looking man entered, inquiring about hiring her services to find someone. Despite his polite demeanor, Karen sensed an underlying motive behind his smile. She saved her work and extended a hand, introducing herself cautiously, uncertain of his true intentions. "My name's John Benetti," he began, introducing himself to Karen Rowland in her office. He explained that his sister, Tori Carson, was desperately trying to locate her husband, David Carson, who had drained their accounts and fled to Rome. John expressed skepticism about David's suitability as a father, given the circumstances, but acknowledged his sister's determination to find him. Despite hiring 2 unsuccessful agencies previously, John was hopeful Karen could succeed where others had failed, having been recommended by a friend. Karen Rowland listened attentively, understanding the challenges of tracing someone in Europe but confident in her abilities and network. She discussed the logistics, costs, and her approach with John, noting his unwavering commitment to the process. John arranged for Tori Carson to meet with Karen the following morning at 9. Karen prepared herself, noting Tori's visible injury and apparent anxiety. As they discussed David's background and potential whereabouts, Karen initially suspected Tori might be a victim of domestic abuse, despite Tori's brother's presence. Despite her reservations about John Benetti, Karen ultimately decided to proceed with the contract, driven by financial pressures due to her husband Bill's illness and mounting medical bills. She accepted the deposit check from John, knowing she would have to conduct her investigation discreetly, lacking her usual police contacts who had been recently terminated for unauthorized database access. As Karen embarked on this challenging assignment, she grappled with ethical dilemmas and personal hardships, hoping to uncover the truth while keeping her own struggles in check. Karen Rowland awaited Hank's return from overseas, knowing his extensive background and intelligence would be invaluable in locating David Carson, especially with his offshore contacts. Despite her immediate inquiries into David's background through social media and newspapers, she found troubling information by the time Hank returned on Friday. David Carson was wanted in connection with the murder of Joseph Benetti. Although Joseph's obituary did not mention a sister named Tori Carson, it did name John Benetti as his brother, a figure with a rumored association with the Gambino crime family from a past racketeering indictment. Despite these unsettling discoveries, Karen was financially motivated to continue pursuing the case. Meanwhile, David Carson woke up in his modest apartment as sunlight and the sounds of diesel engines from fishing boats filled the room. After attending to basic morning rituals, he returned to find Lisa still sleeping in bed. Starting the coffee, he relaxed with a paperback until Lisa stirred awake, expressing interest in coffee and subtly hinting about their activities from the night before. As Lisa playfully engaged with him, David reciprocated, both enjoying their morning routine. Lisa's intimate gesture was a playful exchange of pleasure from the previous night. David had settled in this quiet fishing village after leaving Rome, where he lived modestly and supported himself through odd jobs, particularly providing computer support to local businesses. David, now going by the name John Davis and passing himself off as a Canadian from Ontario, had adopted this new identity seamlessly. The slight alteration from David to Davis suited him, and he responded to it even when inebriated. After enduring 6 months of celibacy following the devastating blow to his self-esteem caused by his wife's affair, Davis found himself approached by Lisa Walker, an outgoing Australian touring Europe after her studies at the University of Sydney. Lisa, a former competitive volleyball player striving for Olympic recognition, had settled temporarily in Catalonia after stints in Ibiza. Lisa took immediate interest in Davis, observing him on previous occasions before finally introducing herself one evening in a foreigner-packed bar. Within moments, she learned his fabricated identity as John Davis, a Canadian. Her intuition told her they would end up together that night, and indeed they did, experiencing an intense sexual encounter. Unbeknownst to Lisa, Davis had spent his celibacy studying women's erotica, determined to understand what had gone wrong in his marriage. His research and newfound knowledge profoundly impressed Lisa, who became the beneficiary of his exploration. Their chemistry ignited, and Lisa returned for more, enjoying unprecedented pleasure. As their relationship progressed over 2 weeks, Lisa, in the throes of satisfaction, couldn't resist questioning Davis about their dynamic. "Davis," she began cautiously, "I have to ask, what's with the sexual prowess? It feels almost scripted, like something out of a porno. Don't get me wrong, the orgasms are incredible, but I can achieve similar results with my vibrator." Davis was taken aback by her candidness, his confusion evident. Lisa sensed his discomfort and quickly clarified her desires. "Okay, Davis, let me explain," she continued. "The anal play, while it feels amazing, I'm not comfortable kissing you afterward. But when you stimulate that sweet spot between my pussy and ass, keep doing that. And as for the restraint thing, some might find it intriguing, but it's not my thing. And your size? It's perfect. Focus more on making love and less on mechanics. Davis absorbed her feedback, realizing he had misinterpreted her needs. He appreciated Lisa's honesty and vowed to adjust their intimacy accordingly, eager to deepen their connection beyond physical pleasure. So, that's exactly what he did. 4 months later, Davis and Lisa were still together, their relationship exclusive and their physical connection as strong as ever. Davis even started considering the idea of asking Lisa to move in with him. Meanwhile, it took 2 weeks for Karen and Hank to locate David Carson in Catalonia. During this time, Karen's conscience began to trouble her deeply. She ultimately decided to act on her misgivings and return John Benetti's money. She arranged for Benetti to come to her office the next day. When he arrived, Karen informed him that finding Carson seemed futile. She even hinted that Carson might be deceased. She handed Benetti a check for the remaining funds after deducting her expenses, admitting her failure. Although Benetti accepted the check, the encounter left Karen uneasy. 2 days later, Karen was leaving her office to meet her children after school. Her husband, Bill, was recovering from a round of chemotherapy and would likely be too ill to cook dinner that night, a common occurrence after his treatments. As Karen approached the subway station, a black SUV pulled up beside her. The rear door opened, revealing John Benetti pointing a pistol at her. "Get in," he commanded. Initially considering escape, Karen hesitated when she saw her daughter, Hannah, seated next to Benetti. Realizing her options were limited, she reluctantly entered the vehicle. "I know you found something," Benetti stated calmly. "It's in your best interest to give it to me." "And if I do?" Karen questioned. "What assurance do I have that you'll let us go?" "None," Benetti replied coldly. "But I'll release you if you cooperate. If not, I guarantee your daughter won't survive, at least not until I've had my way with her." "She's 13, Karen protested. "You can't be that heartless." "Test me," Benetti challenged. "Here we are at your office. Go up, retrieve what you found, and I'll forget this ever happened. Call the police, and your daughter is as good as dead. You have 2 minutes." With little choice, Karen took the elevator up, desperately trying to devise a plan. Ultimately, she reasoned that if Carson and Benetti wanted to eliminate each other, it was beyond her control, especially at the risk of losing Hannah's safety. Grabbing the report, she returned to the SUV. Handing the document to Benetti, he quickly scanned it and nodded approvingly. "You've done well," he acknowledged. 2 other agencies failed to find him over months. You did it in 2 weeks. One more thing, if anyone tips off Carson that we're onto him, Hannah will disappear. No warnings, just gone. Do we understand each other?" Karen nodded in reluctant agreement, squeezing Hannah's hand as they exited the vehicle. In that moment, John Benetti had unwittingly made a grave mistake, underestimating the determination and resourcefulness of a mother protecting her child. A little history. 14 years prior to these events, Karen Rowland, then known as Karen Baker, served in the New York Police Department's Intelligence Division. During her tenure, she collaborated closely with agents from various intelligence agencies, including a man we'll refer to as Hank. They shared not only a profound mutual respect for each other's intellect and physical abilities, but also developed an undeniable attraction over the course of 5 months working together. Their attraction blossomed into a brief love affair, characterized by a deep emotional connection and passionate intimacy. However, both Karen and Hank recognized the challenges of continuing their relationship. Hank was soon scheduled to deploy to the Middle East, and they understood that their affair was unlikely to evolve beyond friendship and physical chemistry. Yet, there was another significant development to contend with. Karen discovered she was pregnant, a revelation that surfaced just a week before Hank's departure for Afghanistan. They deliberated their options and decided that Hank would proceed with his deployment while providing financial support for their child each month. They agreed to revisit their situation upon Hank's return from overseas. Karen accepted the circumstances with optimism, knowing she wanted to raise the child and believing in the genetic inheritance from Hank. Despite the challenges of single parenthood, she felt financially secure and prepared for the journey ahead. However, fate intervened unexpectedly when Karen, 7 months pregnant, nearly stumbled down the stairs of a subway station. Fortunately, a stranger behind her caught her fall. To her surprise, the man turned out to be Bill Rowland, a gentle giant who offered his assistance and quickly became a supportive presence in her life. Grateful for his kindness, Karen accepted Bill's offer for coffee, which led to dinners, outings, and eventually, a deeper connection. As their relationship blossomed, Bill embraced the role of Karen's Lamaze partner during Hannah's birth, marking a pivotal moment in their journey together. However, the question of Hannah's parentage loomed. Would Bill, who had grown fond of both Karen and her daughter, be willing to raise a child who wasn't biologically his own? It was a crucial consideration for any prospective marriage, one that Karen couldn't ignore. As their bond deepened and Hannah grew older, Karen and Bill had a heart-to-heart discussion. Bill broached the sensitive topic that weighed on his mind. "Karen, I have 2 questions," Bill began earnestly. "Firstly, how many children do you envision having?" "I've always imagined having 2 or 3 children," Karen replied sincerely. "What's on your mind?" "Because I'd like us to have a child together," Bill admitted warmly. "I needed to know if Hannah would be your only child." Karen's heart swelled with affection. "Bill, I adore Hannah with all my heart. But I also dream of having a child with my husband. Does that answer your first question?" Bill's smile widened, relieved that their desires aligned. It was a significant milestone in their relationship. "Secondly," Bill continued, his tone serious yet tender, "what happens when Hank returns? You have a child with him. Fidelity is non-negotiable for me. I won't share my wife with another man." Karen responded honestly, her commitment unwavering. "Bill, I made vows to forsake all others, and I intend for us to honor that vow together." Bill's smile grew even broader, reflecting his deepening affection for Karen. Now, it was Karen's turn to await his next question, eager to solidify their future together. "All right, you've asked your questions, and I've answered them. Now I have 2 questions of my own. Firstly, Hank and I discussed this recently. He won't be back for an extended period, at least a couple of years, and frankly, he doesn't see himself as father material. Can you commit to raising Hannah as your own, without any favoritism once we have children of our own? Hank has already agreed to adoption, but he'd like to meet you first before it's official." "I've thought about this a lot, Karen. Yes, if you want me to take on the role of her father, I want that. You know I already love that little girl." Karen couldn't help but smile. "There's one more thing I need to clarify. Hank is willing to be known as Uncle Hank, but can you handle having my ex around from time to time? Remember, I've already given you my word about fidelity." Bill paused briefly before responding. "As long as you don't turn to Hank as a substitute for us when we have issues in the future. My brother Tony's wife had a friend who became more when they had problems. I believe husband and wife should work through their issues together, not with someone whose motives might not align with our best interests. Agreed?" "Agreed." With that settled, Bill pulled out a ring from his pocket. "Karen, will you marry me?" Karen was taken aback, not expecting a proposal so soon after their conversation, but she composed herself enough to say, yes, and give Bill the most romantic kiss of his life. And so, Bill became dad to Hannah, while Hank assumed the role of Uncle Hank. They decided to disclose these details to Hannah at a later time. A year after their wedding, Anthony was born. When Karen was shot and lost her leg, forcing her to leave the police force on disability, she eventually started her own detective agency. She occasionally relied on Hank's knowledge and connections. By then, Bill and Hank had developed a strong friendship akin to brothers. Each man trusted the other implicitly. Hank trusted Bill to love and protect Hannah, while Bill trusted Hank to respect his marriage to Karen. The morning after Hannah's abduction, Karen took the day off from work to gather her thoughts. She knew Bill needed time to recover from his cancer treatments before discussing anything serious. Bill sensed something was amiss and waited for Karen to open up. He also knew she was waiting for him to appear strong before initiating any conversation. After a pleasant lunch together, Bill prepared himself, expecting another discussion about their finances. All right, Karen, what's on your mind? Karen smiled softly as she looked at him, knowing he was still healing inside from his battle with cancer. My goodness, she thought to herself, this man understands me so well and is so in tune. How did I get so lucky? Please, God, let him beat this disease and stay with us. Karen decided to give Bill the condensed version. Bill, I made a mistake. Without knowing the full situation, I accepted a contract from a man connected to the mob named John Benetti. He hired me to locate someone hiding in Europe. Hank and I found the person, but I refused to give Benetti the information because I believe he'll have this man killed. Yesterday, Benetti threatened Hannah. He said if I didn't comply, Hannah would die. I handed over the report. Will he leave Hannah alone now that he has what he wants? Maybe. But what worries me is this. Benetti warned me that if the man in Europe, his name is Carson, is alerted, Hannah will die, likely after being assaulted. If their hired hitman fails for any reason, Benetti might blame me and... Karen couldn't finish her sentence. What do you want to do about it? Call the police? No, I want to inform Hank that this jerk has threatened Hannah. But I didn't want to act without your consent. You're her father. We need to decide together. And Hank can handle this without it leading back to us? I don't want anything to happen to Hannah, Anthony, or you because of mobsters seeking revenge. I'm confident Hank can manage it discreetly. Then call Hank, ask him to come over. Hank arrived at their home within 2 hours. Given the urgency, he feared it might be about Bill's health. Hank wasn't particularly religious, but he silently hoped for Bill's recovery, knowing how instrumental Bill had been in raising his daughter to be the wonderful young woman she was. As he sat in their living room, Hank wasn't prepared for the real reason behind the summons to the Rowland residence. As Karen recounted Benetti's threats, Bill noticed a flicker in Hank's eyes that unsettled him. That expression quickly transformed into a look of intense contemplation. Hank stood up, walked into the kitchen, took a drink from the faucet, and returned to his seat. I'll need technical support, but I can't involve anyone from the agency or my company. We already have a link to John Benetti through our previous investigations. If there's any additional trace, Benetti could vanish, but suspicion could circle back to us. Even if we avoid official scrutiny, the mob's reach is unpredictable. Do you remember that kid we assisted years ago? He could send viruses and hack into computers. We don't need anything that drastic, but his skills could be invaluable. What was his name again? Jeffrey something. You mean Jeffrey Parker, the kid from Philly. I can get in touch with him, unless his contact details have changed. Hank nodded. I'll contact him from an untraceable phone and arrange a meeting. From now on, none of you should be involved. Karen, give me Parker's number, and I'll take it from here. 2 days later, Hank sat in a quiet Philadelphia restaurant just after the lunch rush. With only a couple of waitstaff and one other occupied table at a distance, it was unlikely they would be overheard. Hank watched Jeffrey Parker enter the restaurant, scan the room, then make his way over to their table. Hank stood to greet the tall man. Hello, Jeff. Thanks for meeting with me. Jeff chuckled. How could I say no? You and Karen practically saved my marriage. Saved? I assume things worked out then? Better than I could have imagined. Emma and I welcomed our first child last year, a son named Paul. Couldn't be happier. How's Karen? Karen's doing well, as are her kids. But Bill, her husband, is battling cancer. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. How's he holding up? The doctors are optimistic, but we have a more pressing issue right now, and we could really use your expertise. Hank outlined the situation, his plan to neutralize the threat to Hannah, and what he needed from Jeff to make it happen. After Hank finished, Jeff leaned back in his chair. I can handle the technical side of things, but I have one crucial question. What's the risk this comes back to me? I don't want my family endangered. Hank replied candidly, Jeff, I'm doing everything possible to keep this far from Karen and her family, and the same goes for you and yours. There are only 2 scenarios where you'd be exposed, if you talk, or if I'm caught, tortured, and forced to talk. I don't think you're foolish enough to talk, and I can assure you, the odds of me talking are 1,000,000 to 1. But I understand this is out of your comfort zone. All I can promise is we need your help, and you'll have a lifelong friend, someone you can count on if you ever need special assistance. Jeff smiled at Hank's choice of words before reaching across the table to shake Hank's hand. Give me the name of this guy and the details. I'll need 2, maybe 3 days. How do I reach you when it's done? Hank provided him with a number and instructions, shook Jeff's hand once more, and sincerely thanked him for his assistance. Meanwhile, 4,000 miles away on the same day as Hank's meeting with Jeff, John Davis, formerly David Carson, and Lisa Howard enjoyed a pleasant lunch in a cozy cafe. Lisa playfully teased him. Davis, don't look now, but I think that guy at the bar has a crush on you. He keeps glancing over here, trying not to be obvious, but he's definitely checking you out. I'm totally jealous. Why do all the hot guys in this town want you and not me? David discreetly glanced over at the man. He recognized him from the market the day before. This irritated him. He cared deeply for Lisa and was fond of their life in the town. Now, it seemed like both would become things of the past, just as he began to relax and leave behind his past as David Carson. Hey babe, let's skip out and head to Barcelona for a couple of days. Go back to your room, pack a bag. I'll swing by in 2 hours, and we'll catch the train. Sound good? Of course. What do you think? Lisa replied eagerly. She got up to leave the cafe. As David settled the bill, Lisa couldn't resist. She stuck her tongue out at the stranger and remarked, "He's all mine," as she sauntered past him. David believed he had shaken off the tail after spending half an hour ensuring he wasn't followed. However, it turned out the pursuer had been onto him longer than he thought, because as David entered his apartment, there the man was, waiting in his room. John Benetti wants you to know this came from him. The stranger brandished a large knife, an exact replica of the one David had used to kill Joe Benetti. What neither John Benetti nor his hired assassin knew was that for the past year, David Carson had been diligently taking self-defense classes. David had always anticipated this day and had resolved long ago not to go down without a fight. The unfortunate hitman John had sent didn't stand a chance. David had his pepper spray ready since he spotted the hitman. Before the assailant could react, his eyes and mouth were filled with the stinging spray. David seized the hitman's knife-wielding arm, but not before receiving a shallow cut himself. Pushing through the pain, David forced the hitman to drop the knife and subdued him in a chokehold. Despite the hitman's struggles, within a minute, he succumbed. After tending to his arm wound, which fortunately didn't require stitches, David dragged the lifeless body into the vacant apartment across the hall, dumped it in the bathtub, and returned to his room to pack. He hoped the body wouldn't start decomposing before he made his getaway. David felt remorseful. He knew Lisa would be waiting for him to pick her up for their trip to Barcelona. Instead, he gathered a bag of clothes and personal items and walked to the bus station. He needed to retrieve his stash of cash in Rome before disappearing again. Latin America seemed like a promising destination. Meanwhile, John Benetti was growing impatient. Sal had called from Spain the previous day, confirming he had located Carson. Sal planned to surveil Carson for a few more days to ensure a smooth operation, estimating it wouldn't take longer than 4 days. John understood the need to give Sal space, but found it challenging not to micromanage. Needing to vent, John decided to visit the brothel in the Bronx near the port. They had a selection of young girls, and John's appetite for youth was stimulated ever since he abducted that private investigator's daughter. He almost wished the PI had attempted retaliation just to justify deflowering her. Thinking of the girl, what was her name? Hannah. Well, maybe I'll just take her anyway. John's mind wandered as he approached his Mercedes, unaware of the man walking down the sidewalk. Before reaching the car door, John felt a prick in his neck and the world began to fade to black. It took John 4 hours to regain consciousness. By then, he found himself suspended by his hands, bound and secured with ropes running through pulleys and tied to a cleat. His feet, thighs, and mouth were also tightly bound. John looked at the stranger standing before him, someone he didn't recognize from any prior encounter. A peculiar scent caught his attention, and he glanced down at the large tub positioned beneath him. The stranger grinned. "Hello, John. No, you don't know me. I'm Hannah's biological father. I understand you've been threatening my little girl." "No, don't shake your head. Too late now. Karen told me you were going to make Hannah a woman." "That's going to be tough. You may not have the equipment to make that happen in another half hour or less. You may not have much else either. I'm not typically an evil man. I can honestly say I've never tortured a man before. But there's always a first time, I guess. The tub under you is filled with caustic soda, sodium hydroxide. I see from your eyes you've heard of it. Some of your peers use it to get rid of bodies. Is that why they never found Jimmy Hoffa? I understand the bodies are usually dead before they're boiled down. Too bad I'm not in such a gracious, forgiving mood." Hank released the rope from the cleat and lowered Benetti a few inches, his toes just above the tub now. John Benetti was frantically shaking his head. "How long do you think it would take for you to rape my little girl? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? How long would you make her suffer before you finally killed her and released her from the suffering? I know you can't answer me, but let's just say a half hour, just for the hell of it." Hank looked at his watch. "It's 3:30. Let's wait until 4, then decide what's next." Hank sat and read a book. John started to swing his legs, trying to move his body away from the tub. "Stop that or I'll lower you in right now," Hank shouted. John froze at the threat, still hoping the man might be bluffing. Hank returned to his book. At 4 in the morning, Hank looked up from his book. "Well, John, have you learned your lesson? Do you promise to leave Hannah and her family alone?" John couldn't believe his ears. He nodded vigorously, silently trying to assure this stranger that he would comply with his demands. But deep down, he was already plotting the revenge he would exact on this man, Karen, her family, and especially on little Hannah. "You probably think I'm letting you go because I fear your mob connections. But that's not the reason. I know about your offshore accounts, and I'm sure they do too. They'll be asking themselves if you vanish, did we know about all his accounts? It doesn't matter if there are other accounts or not, you can't prove a negative. So, if I wanted you to disappear and make the mob think you betrayed them, I'd leave breadcrumbs here and there. Just enough to send everyone looking in the wrong direction, following false leads. Make them think you skipped town on your own. Anyway, that's what I'd do if I were going to kill you. But I think you've learned your lesson here, and as long as I have your word that you'll leave Hannah alone, you'll walk away." Hank walked over to the cleat and untied the rope. He pulled John up slightly and paused. "One more time, John. Do you agree to leave Hannah and her family alone?" Once more, John nodded his agreement to the terms. He couldn't believe his luck. Who was this guy? How did he know about the offshore accounts? If he was smart enough to know about the accounts, why was he foolish enough to let John live? "You know what, John? I don't believe you." With those words, Hank dropped Benetti into the tub up to his waist. It took a moment for John to comprehend what had just transpired. The pain was unbearable. Within minutes, he lost consciousness, and Hank lowered the rest of his body into the tub before sealing it shut. Using a forklift, Hank managed to load the tub into the back of his pickup truck and embarked on a long journey westward to a remote location he knew near Lebanon Township. Miguel and Roberto Sanchez harbored a deep-seated hatred for all Americans. This animosity stemmed from the 4 years they spent in the U.S. with their mother, working in Washington picking apples and in California harvesting various crops, before being apprehended by the INS and deported back to Mexico. The brothers felt it was unjust. During their time in the States, they had kept out of trouble, diligently working and caring for their ailing mother. Despite knowing many undocumented immigrants who resorted to theft and worse, their mother kept them on a strict path, forbidding them from joining gangs. Their mother's health deteriorated rapidly after their deportation, and she passed away the previous year. Miguel and Roberto firmly believed she would still be alive if they had remained in the U.S. and received proper medical care. With her death, their resentment towards Americans only deepened. For 3 years after leaving Catalonia, David Carson wandered from town to town throughout Central America and Mexico. Currently renting a room in a villa owned by a retired lawyer near a small coastal village southwest of Ensenada, David had heard through his sources in the States that John Benetti had disappeared shortly after the failed assassination attempt. For over a year after receiving this news, David lived in constant fear, never staying in one place for more than a month. He assumed John had discovered the death of his hired hitman and was now personally hunting David down. Unbeknownst to David, only 4 people in the world knew he had nothing to fear from John Benetti, and they never discussed it amongst themselves. Walking home after another night at a local cantina, David was weary of his transient life and lack of purpose beyond nightly drinking and flirting with foreign women passing through town. He consciously avoided local women, knowing well the danger of inciting jealousy among the local men, whether over someone's sister, wife, or girlfriend. Adhering to these rules was challenging. While the local women understood that expatriates had more financial means, David was cautious. Lost in thought about his family back home and contemplating a plan to return to the States, David was caught off guard when a young man blocked his path. David took a brief moment to size up the situation before noticing the knife in the boy's hand. "Hey gringo, how much money you got in them pockets?" Roberto Sanchez relished the shock and fleeting fear he saw in the man's eyes. He enjoyed using the term gringo, knowing it stung the foreigner's pride. David didn't mind parting with a few pesos. He started to withdraw bills from his front pocket while simultaneously strategizing his response if things escalated. Despite his nomadic lifestyle, he had kept up with his self-defense training and believed he could handle the boy if necessary. Keeping a watchful eye on the knife, David handed over the bills cautiously. "The wallet, too, gringo," Roberto insisted, his tone harsher this time. "Fuck you, I'll keep my wallet. You can have the money, but I'm keeping my IDs and shit." "You don't want to fuck with me, kid," David retorted defiantly. Before he could finish his sentence, David heard a distinct click behind him. He turned just in time to catch the glint of moonlight off the blade before feeling the searing pain as the knife plunged into his side. Shocked and reeling from the sudden attack, he barely had a moment to react before another knife found its mark in his chest. As darkness closed in around him, David glimpsed the twisted satisfaction in the assailant's eyes. Epilogue. Karen Rowland was taken aback when her secretary ushered Tori Carson into her office. "She insisted on seeing you immediately, boss." "What should I do?" April asked. "Let her in, April." "I'll handle this," Karen replied calmly. April left the office, leaving the door slightly ajar as she returned to her desk. Karen gestured for Tori to take a seat in front of her desk. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Carson?" Karen inquired, her tone neutral. "Firstly, let me apologize for my part in what happened before. I should have apologized years ago, but I was a coward. My cowardice led me to be complicit in Joe Benetti's death. I didn't have the courage to say no when he manipulated me, nor when John Benetti coerced me into deceiving you about my husband's whereabouts. There was never a baby. It was all a lie concocted to protect myself," Tori confessed, her voice tinged with regret. Karen sat silently, processing Tori's words. A part of her simmered with anger, wanting to lash out at the woman who had played a role in almost destroying her family. Yet, another part understood the dynamics of manipulation and coercion that often ensnare vulnerable individuals. Reflecting on her own life with Bill, now in remission, Karen felt a wave of gratitude for having a strong and caring partner. Pulling herself out of her reverie, Karen responded evenly, "Mrs. Carson, you don't owe me any apologies. If anything had happened to my daughter, I might not have been as forgiving. But thankfully, my family is safe, and that's what matters." Tori shifted uncomfortably in her seat, realizing she had yet to explain the reason for her visit. "I didn't just come to apologize, I also came to hire you," Tori continued. "Hire me? For what?" Karen asked, her curiosity piqued. "David was murdered last month in Mexico. His body is still there, waiting to be claimed. Despite everything, he doesn't deserve to be buried in a pauper's grave. I want to bring him back to New York for a proper burial," Tori explained, her voice tinged with sadness. She paused, then added, also, when David left, he took a significant amount of money. There's a chance he may have funds in a bank in Mexico. I want you to help me recover what rightfully belongs to me. Much of that money was mine too, and I need closure on this matter. The cold pragmatism in Tori's words turned Karen's stomach. She replied sharply, I think you've mistaken me for someone who cares about your problems. I suggest you leave my office and never show your face here again. Tori nodded solemnly, realizing her plea had fallen on deaf ears. Without another word, she stood and left Karen's office, closing the door softly behind her. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel not to miss new videos.